Hello and welcome again to Sport Unlocked, giving the lowdown on the week's sports news. Coming up, the fallout from the Champions League final chaos in Paris as the police chief faced a Senate hearing. Also, news from Michel Platini and Sepp Blatter going on trial in Switzerland. And news from a big decision from FIFA over World Cup placings in Qatar. Well, the World Cup should have been starting this week in normal times had it not been moved to the winter in Qatar, but we've been keeping ourselves busy in other matters. Joining me, Rob Harris from the Associated Press as ever, Tariq Panja from the New York Times, and Martyn Ziegler from the Times. And notice particularly high listening we've had in Saudi Arabia this week.
Well, that's not surprising, Rob, because there's been a lot. I think you guys have been in Hertfordshire, I think, at this LIV golf thing, which is the Saudi-backed sort of breakaway thing, which is, I think it's fair to say, has caused sort of huge shockwaves in the sport. But I just wanted to ask you guys a question. So the sounds like they're paying people like Phil Mickelson hundreds of millions of dollars. I think his is 200 million. So they're putting in all this money for this tournament. They haven't even sold the TV rights, as far as I can make out. Hardly anyone's going to watch. So, is this a business decision to launch this breakaway, or is there some other reason?
Hard to see a business case in the way you've described that. There were attendees at the event. Most of them, or at least a fair portion of them, were on discounted or free tickets, so they were there. There was, minimal TV coverage, if any. These players are paid more money than they've ever earned in career earnings just to participate. The winner's fee is higher than any other golf tournament in history for each of these events, $4 million. So yeah, hard to see a business case at all. But talking to people at the PIF, the Saudi Investment Fund, they seem to be suggesting they wouldn't make any investment unless there is a payout, a long-term payout maybe. We might be waiting decades to see if this ever makes any money. So what else, Rob, could this be about?
It can only be yet another sports branch of the extension of Saudi PR in the attempt to use the Public Investment Fund to show a different image of the country around the world, because there's very little evidence of how they're making money. They seem to have done some TV partnerships with DAZN and some other broadcasters. Who knows how much is being earned for those? We've not been given any press announcement from Live Golf at all. And that is what we discovered how it is pronounced. The LIV standing for the Roman numerals 54, the number of holes 54 over the 3 days. But yeah, very little apart from the sort of merchandise and beer and food stands where there's actually money coming in. And not many fans we spoke to had paid, although I did find a 91-year-old who had actually paid his 60 odd pounds to go in on Thursday, the first day.
Yeah, so that really speaks to the new generation of golf. I hope the 91-year-old fan had a good time, but that was the other thing. It was launched on a Thursday, a school week in the UK. There was very few kids or anyone under 40 or a retiree there, and there were some school kids who were bussed in especially for the event. And Rob said, it didn't have a Saudi feel though. It didn't. There was no insignia of Saudi Arabia. But one thing that they did do was make it look anything but Saudi. It was the kind of all the kind of cliched knickknacks of London and the UK. There was like red Route Master bus selling Pims. There was a red post box. There was the red-coated Grenadier Guards, a mock of those anyway, playing British standards, and black minicabs or black cabs with Live Golf livery on their side, delivering the players to their various holes in the shotgun start and then bringing them back. Decent fare for those taxi drivers.
Yeah, and this is how those fake Grenadier Guards, a band of some sort, did introduce the start of play, the first hole, with Phil Mickelson amongst those teeing off to kick off this Rebel Golf series.
Let's go, Phil!
So there wasn't. So no sort of Saudi flavour there, but was there a sort of Newcastle flavour? Because the sort of top people in Saudi golf also happen to be the directors of Newcastle United. I think that's right. Yasser Al Rumayyan and Majed Al Saror, both directors of Newcastle. Whether they were in evidence as well, at least part of the time. I think, is that correct?
At the start of the tournament, at least the first hole, Dustin Johnson and Phil Mickelson, the players that attracted most of the crowd as they started. There was Majid Al Saror giving them little hugs and handshakes after they'd played their first shots. He was standing with Greg Norman, the CEO of this event, and he was quite visible. And a day earlier, Mickelson played in a pro-am event with the Newcastle chairman, the PIF chief executive, Yasser Al Rumayyan.
Yeah, one thing noticeable at the start of this event is very little attention on the golf itself. Not even the golf regulars in the media pack are really talking about who's been leading. But Saturday, the winner collects $4 million. So a pretty huge windfall, unprecedented in the world of golf, the richest event ever in the world of golf. One thing that was striking but so expected, coordinated, it was ready to land, was just after they teed off right at the start at 2:15 on Thursday. The PGA landed their statement, their memo that they sent out to the players who had joined the league without being handed waivers. They were unsanctioned and they were informed they were now ineligible for future PGA Tour events.
Yeah, so I mean that's obviously a huge blow really for the players taking part in the Live Tour, and they reacted furiously, didn't they? The Tour Live saying this is vindictive. So yeah, interesting sort of power struggle there. Another couple of points of interest from the week, which I noticed. One was that in the Pro-Am tournament, Chris Kirchner, the US businessman who's meant to be taking over Derby, was playing, and it's sort of bad timing because on that very day, it emerged that his takeover has sort of on the verge of collapse, and that his promises of providing money for the club have failed to materialise. So some quite good doorstepping by the BBC sports editor Dan Roan, putting him on the spot, and he refused to answer.
Yeah, it was a moment that Putz wanted to avoid, thinking maybe a bit of golf would be a way to escape some of the spotlight, but there he was caught in the crosshairs. But this was a week very much about what was happening in terms of the media golfers' interactions, and press conference after press conference with all the top players centered around just why they'd signed up to this Saudi sovereign wealth funded series and all the issues with that, all the concerns of human rights groups. And well, this was when I got the chance to put a particular question to Graham McDowell.
You talked about how this series is a force for good, and the journey you've been told about Saudi Arabia is on. How is that journey helping the women oppressed in Saudi Arabia, the migrant groups, their rights violated, the LGBTQ individuals who are criminalised, the families of the 81 men who were executed in March, and those being bombed in Yemen?
Yeah, I mean, I wish I had the ability to be able to have that conversation with you. I think as golfers, if we tried to cure, geopolitical situations in every country in the world that we play golf in, we wouldn't play a lot of golf. It's a really hard question to answer. We're just here to focus on the golf and kind of, what it does globally for the role models that these guys are and that we are. And that's a really hard question to get into.
Do you think any of the players managed to answer those questions with any degree of satisfaction?
Well, the thing about McDowell is he actually did bring up Jamal Khashoggi in an earlier answer. He did acknowledge the issues with the death of the Washington Post journalist in 2018 in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, a death in which the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has been found to be culpable in some way by US intelligence agencies. Crown Prince does deny wrongdoing. He is the head of the PIF, which does own this series. So at least McDowell did give a sense of recognising why people might be concerned. what made it particularly relevant, I think, to ask McDowell about those various Saudi issues is the fact he, in the early answer, had talked about how actually golf can effectively be a force of change. So that's why I was intrigued to know, well, how can it change Saudi Arabia? A lot of other players did largely centre their answers on the business case, effectively, which was their way almost of saying, I'm just doing it for the money.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I wonder what's going to happen now in the future. You've got on one side people like Rory McIlroy, Tiger Woods refusing to take part. I mean, a lot of these live tour players are close to the end of their careers, I think it's fair to say. So maybe it's a sort of like almost going to become a veterans tour.
None of the world's top 10 golfers are currently on this tour. It'll be interesting to see as this potential legal battle develops between the PGA and players, if it does not come to a sort of satisfactory, rapid sort of rapprochement, what exactly happens? Or do they just actually end up coming together and the PGA recognises its own tour could be damaged? Or do these younger players, more successful current players, actually stick with the existing structures and all the certainty that that does offer? On the Saudi matters, one thing that I think struck me was how well prepared some of the players actually seem to be for the answers. They are being paid a lot of money. They have got political experience involved. They've got Ari Fleischer, the former White House press secretary under George W. Bush, leading some of the press conferences, asking some of the questions. So someone who's got now, and I wonder how much time they have actually spent with the golfers themselves. I mean, this was what happened when I asked Phil Mickelson, had he even consulted human rights groups? And we've actually had to edit out the silence because it went on for well over 10 seconds. You don't want to listen to so much silence, but here's the question and the answer.
Did you consult any human rights groups? And beyond Khashoggi, what are the human rights violations you're particularly referring to when you acknowledge those?
I think I've addressed that about as thoroughly as I'm going to.
You said they were ill prepared, but there was some attempt to prepare them. Our colleague Riyadh Al-Samurai been writing really well about this event in the Daily Mail sports section, and he's managed to get hold of what he's described as a crib sheet for answers under subheadings, and the subheadings are why are you playing in this, money grab, and the PGA Tour bans and sanctions. Nowhere, at least in this list that he's mentioned, does it refer to the human rights element. And I must say, when you see the crib sheet, particularly when you see someone like Graham McDowell, who we heard from on the first playing day and earlier, you could see the lines, because he mentioned being a independent contractor loads of times. He talked about a great opportunity for him, his family, and the chance to advance his career, to try something different, a chance to grow the game, all the things that are in this crib sheet. So, it's not as off the cuff as it might have seemed.
One thing that surprised me was the fact there's been no attempt by the Saudi government, even those working on behalf of the government in recent weeks, in particular, building up to this, to attempt to even discuss the wider Saudi story, even their attempt to sort of talk about progress in areas like women's rights and other areas. And even yet, we've been reporting on this for many years in so many different strands, with the build-up to the Newcastle sale, the piracy issues involving the skirmishes diplomatically with Qatar. But yeah, maybe it's their attempt to distance themselves from Saudi. They're almost trying to completely dissociate themselves from the Saudi connection, or hope people don't draw on it, even though PIF are obviously providing the funding. There is no mention of PIF anyway. If you were just wandering into the course or talking to anyone, you wouldn't have a clue who actually owned the series.
Well, you might have, though, if you've walked around the press room or some of the course. There was a lot of PIF executives knocking around. Unfortunately, none of them wanted to go on the record to answer any questions. They were very perfectly friendly people, very nice people, quite helpful. But part of my, if I was the players, I'd be a little bit frustrated. Say, well, guys, we're getting all these questions. Could you give us a hand? Why don't you answer some of them too? And there wasn't anyone from the PIF to actually who was willing to go on the record and answer the questions that a lot of us might have had.
And if Greg Norman perhaps had done the opening press conference as the boss of this tour, effectively, he might have taken some of the immediate sting and heat of some of the questions and some of the issues. And some of the other players could potentially have actually then said, well, as Greg said, and sort of cited his answers, but we've heard nothing from the guy who's helped put this tour together to recruit so many of the players to come and defect from the PGA Tour.
I think from Greg Norman's last public appearance on this, when he embarrassed himself completely by saying the Saudis had learned lessons from the murder of Jamal Khashoggi.
No, he also said we all make mistakes, didn't he, Martyn?
We all make mistakes. That was it. Yeah, we all make mistakes. We need to make mistakes and move on.
Yeah.
I'm not surprised he's not been put up again.
Yeah, I mean, there were some issues with their media relations at times, in particular with the journalist who Phil Mickelson interviewed for those comments that led to him calling the Saudis scary motherfuckers.
Is that Alan Shipnuck?
He didn't get a chance to reacquaint himself with Phil Mickelson after the first day's play because as he was trying to enter the press room, he was barred from doing so. He's not sure why. They said it's because there were a number of reasons they raised. One of them was he briefly crossed the rope, it seemed, accidentally to the photographer's side during play, and et cetera, et cetera. By the time it was all resolved, anyone he wanted to talk to was more or less gone. He said his laptop was being held hostage in the press room, was how he described it.
Yeah, and he did have the support of various other journalists. We were there when we finally realised what had been going on. That was obviously too late for him to speak to Phil Mickelson. And then I saw him when he was being let back in. They were all apologetic, the Live Golf staff, but that sort of did overlook how they'd managed to wind down the clock, so he missed the key parts of the chance to talk to players.
Martyn, but he did provide some further details, didn't he?
He did, yeah. But just if you look at Alan Shipnuck's his Twitter feed, it's quite funny. He's after being sort of barred entry by what he referred to as goons, he texted Greg Norman and said, "I was muscled out of Phil's press conference. Please call me to discuss." And then Greg Norman replies to him with his screenshot of the text messages saying, "Did not hear. Thanks for letting me know." and then turns out that Greg Norman's standing right behind him and there's a picture of him standing right behind Alan Shipnuck when he's being barred entry. So clearly he did know. So it's all a slightly amusing end to that particular incident.
Yeah, and there was an attempt early in the week, perhaps try and shut me down from asking a question, having asked that particularly cutting one to Graham McDowell. So when things did finally start in terms of the golf, I was with Tariq waiting for Phil Mickelson to tee off, and we started to hear a conversation behind us from some people complaining about media scrutiny and coverage, too much focus on the Saudi elements and criticism of this. So when there was a quiet moment, we did turn around and introduce ourselves as journalists, and this is how the exchange with one gentleman did unfold.
So, if you guys have huge issues with it, then why are you guys here in the first place?
Because you report on it. The job is reporting on the story.
Yeah, but their job's to play golf as well at the end of the day.
Yeah, so we're doing. Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. But the news value.
The more news you guys give it.
But do you think we should ignore it then? I guess is the question.
No, I mean, but I think it's a bit unfair on the players because they're doing their job. I think politics and golf, or because you look at other sports as well. You got it in tennis as well, Formula One. I think the golfers have probably taken a bigger brunt than the other sports have.
Because they're individuals, perhaps, rather than teams, or.
I don't think that should make a difference.
No,
really.
Is that why?
I don't know why. I don't know why the golfers have taken.
Because Newcastle United got quite a lot of attention, didn't they?
Yeah, of course. But then you've got the UK government controls who owns football clubs here as well. So if they're happy with it and they're accepting foreign money, why are people like Phil being, or even Paul to the westward? I thought some of their questions are a little bit unfair.
Yeah.
I think it's a bigger issue. I think there is an issue there. It's life-changing amounts of money.
Not for them.
Well, for the golfers.
Yeah, some of them are multi-millionaires, aren't they?
Yeah, but it's still life-changing.
A lot of golfers didn't. Rory McIlroy, for instance, didn't want to do it because he's rich enough. much money do you need? It wouldn't have changed his life. That
But
halo effect,
in some ways, this raises awareness of the issues. So it works. I mean, there's positive publicity, there's negative publicity.
Have you read more about it?
Yeah, exactly. So I know more about it because it's highlighted more.
Yeah.
So in a way, that's for each individual or people to make up their own minds on how they feel about it.
So that was Rav in conversation with Tariq. It was good to engage at least, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think it's important that, as we've said before, I think we deserve as much scrutiny as anyone else. We seem to be, certainly on this pod, commenting on all and sundry. If people have their views on how the media cover things, it's nice to have that engagement.
Yeah, so it'll be interesting to see just how does this series actually unfold. There are 8 events this year, 10 next year. What's the aim for 2024? Is it 14 events?
14.
And lots of prize money, lots of release fees, and waiting to see what happens with those. Clashes between the PGA, the European Tour, now the DP World Tour, and Live Golf. Well, of course, golf investment in sport at the centre of so much of what we cover, and things that unfolded differently. Maybe we'd be in Qatar now for the start of the World Cup. They did bid for a World Cup beginning in June. FIFA didn't give the option in 2010 to give alternative dates, but in those years afterwards, eventually FIFA effectively said, no, you've got to move it to November, December. But this week, we've been hearing yet more evidence of why Sepp Blatter, who was FIFA president at the time in 2010, didn't want the World Cup to go to Qatar. He'd already said this in an interview, colluding with Martyn a few years ago, but the latest was when he finally had his first day in court. He's standing trial with Michel Platini all over an unauthorised payment that led to their downfall from the world of football in 2015. So what have we been hearing at the court in Switzerland?
A lot of the stuff has come out before, but it's sort of, in a court of law, stated that a gentleman's agreement was hatched between Platini and Blatter in about 1998. Blatter wanted Platini to go and work as his advisor, asked him how much. He said $1 million, talking about Swiss francs. Blatter said, we can't pay you that much because FIFA hasn't got any money at the time, but we'll pay you that later. And it was like, much later, it was eventually paid, wasn't it? Something like 13 years later.
And it was, the Platini's evidence was kind of odd in many ways, in the sense he seemed to have kind of disregarded that money and it wasn't really important to him. And then suddenly it really was, because he'd found out that FIFA was paying these massive payoffs, and he name-checked Jerome Champagne, an advisor to Sepp Blatter, as one of the people who got paid off, and said he should be getting his own money. The other thing, if you look at FIFA's accounts in that period, it did have the money to pay him. So that's also quite a weird line. Platini seemed to suggest he wasn't someone who was that interested in money. Funny that, given that he was then asking for this cash. The other thing from this Swiss case, they were only really on, I don't know if it's a stand there, I wasn't in the court, audition they call it, for about an hour, if that. And they weren't really asked any tough questions, really. It was more repetitive and more just kind of information. It didn't seem like the adversarial courtroom as we see in the UK and the US. One thing, Martyn, was Blatter's monthly costs. He said his monthly living expenses are 25,000 Swiss francs. That's about $25,000 a month. You think, blimey, he's an 86-year-old bachelor. What's he spending all that money on?
Fine wine.
He does like watches too, doesn't he?
Yeah, yes. Doesn't get any free watches anymore, so obviously that's a big monthly expense.
And the fact on the World Cup vote, he talked about voting for the US for 2022 rather than Qatar, because he said he wanted the two superpowers to get the World Cup. Russia in 2018, as they did do so, but didn't go to plan in 2022. And many suggestions over the years that actually that was the vote that triggered the downfall of all the FIFA hierarchy, eventually led to the wave of arrests in 2015, because it got the FBI interested in investigating the world of FIFA after this vote.
Yeah, so I suppose the USA they've had to wait, haven't they? So but at least they have got it with Mexico and Canada for 2026.
Yeah, though that means they've had it twice in '94 and most of the 2026 tournament. Well, Africa's only had it once. South America's had it once in 4 decades now. So not necessarily an equal distribution around the world. And you know, as I said, we would have been in Qatar now. A lot of people maybe bemoaning we aren't having this normal World Cup summer. From a European perspective, we're noticing some of the players looking pretty fatigued in the Nations League. Is there a sense that actually the players and maybe even some fans won't have welcomed the World Cup now? And it might have been an unexpected benefit of the chaos of the Qatar World Cup and having to move it to the winter because of the heat, and then due to the pandemic disrupting so much of the scheduling, that actually it's managed to sort of help things out. Maybe it's a better tournament later in the year, despite all the many rights issues and all the questions over how they won the bid.
Yeah, I actually think it will be, because I think that there is a sort of a fatigue factor, definitely, that you can see with some players, depending on how many matches they've played. But if you look at some of the players from the English Premier League, they played crazy amounts of matches, because especially those who've gone all the way to the Champions League final, and once you go to the end of those European matches, then you start totting up a lot of games.
And the point as we record, qualifying hasn't even finished yet because there's still the intercontinental playoffs to come in Qatar next week. So who knows how they'd have fit those in because of all the pandemic issues. If we had been looking at a June start, I was in Cardiff to see Wales beat Ukraine for the final European spot. What an atmosphere it was there from the Welsh fans getting back to the World Cup for the first time in 64 years. Ukraine, unfortunately, missing out despite all that sort of fervour and emotion around the team playing despite the war. And as we wait for the conclusion of qualifying finally, fans will be looking to buy their tickets, particularly the Wales fans who didn't know they'd make it there. But Martyn, are there many available for them?
I don't think that's going to be too much of an issue, really, because looking at some of for example, the ticket allocation given to England for the opening group matches, they get 8% of the available seating capacity, so that's not very much. But you still have a situation, for example, for the England-Iran and England-USA matches where the allocation is 2,489 and then 4,158 respectively. They're not sold out, so there are tickets available, and it's not quite as low as Russia, where I think for England's opening match in Volgograd against Tunisia, there were less than 2,000 tickets bought. But it just shows that for various reasons, obviously it's going to be quite expensive. It's not straightforward to get there, and accommodation is not easy to secure either.
Hang on. Martyn, sorry, it's supposed to be really easy to get there. Isn't that the point? It's right in the middle of the world. It's not a long flight, and that's part of the issue. It's the gouging of prices. I think we should be clear here that the flight costs associated with Qatar Airways, which is state owned, and the state is one of the richest states on the planet. And during the bidding, said it will be a very accessible World Cup. The flight costs are astronomical to get there,
about
as are the accommodation costs. And you can think about all the promises that the bidding team made back in 2009-10, and the fact that Qatar is ridiculously rich. How fans are now having to pay thousands of dollars. I heard from a guy who said it was more expensive for him to take the 3-hour flight from where he is in India to Qatar than a recent trip he took to the United States. And again, I think the Qatari government or the authorities there need to get a grip of this.
They're not really communicated well in terms of to fans just what the experience will be like, how they can get there easily and affordably. Anecdotally, talk to fans who've managed to get on one of the cruise liners that are going to be docked in Doha and several of them in one room. It's actually quite reasonable, but there aren't that many rooms available. There's only a few thousand. And again, they've not fully communicated to the world using their well-paid ambassadors to talk about the fan experience. They could put David Beckham up to explain how things would be like for them there.
Well, he still hasn't explained why he actually is an ambassador, so that will be a start. But the thing with the tickets is, in order to get accommodation, you actually have to press go on your ticket. So you have to commit to buying your tickets, and only then does the accommodation portal. So there's kind of this Hobson's choice that the fans are facing. That, do I get these tickets and then be priced out when I find out what my hotel's going to cost? It's a mess. And I think if you speak to the organisers, I think some of them privately will agree that it's a mess and they need to get a grip of it.
It's yeah. I mean, I think I looked on the accommodation website for fans, so you can get a apartment for $80 a night, but that's if you're the group of four of you and you're prepared to share a room. So it's not, it's by no means straightforward. And if you go to these cruise ships, it's really, really expensive. I think the Football Supporters Association have thought that if you're an England fan going all the way to the final, with all the cost of flights and stuff, I think it would cost £7,000.
And there's also all the external police and security to house in Qatar. And we've discovered this week that thousands of police from Morocco are going to be going to Qatar to help to secure this World Cup. And I'm sure they'll all be analysing the fallout from the Champions League final in Paris and the chaos that unfolded at the Stade de France. And this week, we've been hearing yet more evidence about just what went wrong. Finally, the Paris police chief partially apologising to the Liverpool fans over what they faced, being tear-gassed before the final against Real Madrid, being accused of having thousands of them trying to get in without tickets or with false tickets. And it's the French politicians who've been challenging their accounts. And also, one of the most significant things, it turns out the Stade de France CCTV footage no longer exists from that night.
Did he even partially apologise? I thought he defended the use of tear gas, so there was no other option. But just some people had been sort of tear gassed wrongly.
Maybe he's apologising for the fact they were seen tear gassing the fans rather than actually apologising for tear gassing the fans.
Yeah, but as you say, the thing about the CCTV not being available to back up the police's claims is just disgraceful.
Not only disgraceful, but either it's incompetent or willful, because this CCTV, like a lot of CCTV in use, whether it's a shopping centre or a stadium, etc., there is a time limit when it automatically deletes, in this case, 7 days. This situation flared up immediately and became a scandal, and an investigation was called for while the two teams were still on the field. The idea that someone just allowed the 7 days to lapse without securing it just makes you wonder what kind of motives it was, or what kind of motivation there was, because it just seems bonkers, doesn't it?
Yeah, it is only the footage from the Stade de France itself we're talking about, though. The French police have made clear that they are still in possession of images that will be available to the courts for any investigations. And there's already been one preliminary report come from the French government, and that has highlighted systematic failings on the night, multiple failures, as they put it, particularly the dysfunction around the preparation outside for preparing for the crowd, insufficient communication between the transport operators and the public bodies, a lack of coordination generally, and not recognising those warning signs regarding, as they call it, the malevolent individuals who assembled near the crowd next to the stadium.
There was another claim as well about where this number of 30 to 40,000 ticketless fans, a number that the Interior Minister was bandying about from the first day, and police officials too. And the chap, the head of police, Monsieur Lallemont, he was asked, and he said, yes, he was the one who provided this number. And they said, well, how did you get it? He said, well, it's not scientific. Basically, this is what people were telling him. So there's no real basis to this beyond, I guess, almost hearsay.
And yet they were so definitive on Twitter, particularly the Interior and Sports Ministers on Saturday night, as the game had just finished in Paris, and they were definitive statements and set this sort of false narrative that did crumble very quickly. The fact we're even at the hearing status in the Senate less than 2 weeks after the final, where their accounts are being challenged. And this is in a period ahead of parliamentary elections as well.
Yeah, it's probably going to be a long time, I think, before the Stade de France or Paris gets the Champions League final again. What do you think about one of my colleagues, Tom Roddy, did a quite interesting piece around the UEFA's head of security, Zeljko Pavlika. This guy is a fellow Slovenian and friend of Alexander Shefrin, the president. And the sort of questions about whether he's sort of taken on this head of security role properly, because at least one person, Steve Frostick, a former British policeman, he resigned from UEFA in February. And it does seem as though UEFA really have got a bit of a vacuum, or had a vacuum, in terms of having a proper team in place to make sure everything was okay.
Yeah, I guess there's a couple of questions there. One of the questions you raise is in Tom Roddy's piece in your paper. There was this question about cronyism as well. I think in Tom's piece it said the UEFA president was the best man at this chap's wedding, and then he hired him. And of course, the Slovenian security official has security expertise, is what UEFA is saying. He has. He was part of the crew that was protecting the leader of the country, the Slovenian country. So he has that experience. But whether it's enough to be responsible for stadium security and events like this remains to be seen. And I guess at UEFA and a lot of these football organisations, there is this sort of creeping cronyism, or perhaps even historic cronyism, where people are often hired, whether it's UEFA and elsewhere. There's plenty of examples at UEFA, but also I would use FC Barcelona example. Gianni Infantino at FIFA as well has surrounded himself with people he knows, but maybe not necessarily as close as the UEFA president at the moment.
It's not unusual in any business where people bring in people that they know because they think that they have the experience and the knowledge that they can do the job. So I think that's a sort of just happens everywhere. It'd be interesting to see what the outcome of this inquiry that UEFA have commissioned, because I think that it's come to the point now that they need more of a specialist team looking at things like Champions League and just not just ceding control to the National Association or the National Police. They need to be out there and say, look, where are the signs to show the fans coming in where to go? Where's this? Where's this?
But it's 2022, Martyn. Surely this is their biggest event, isn't it? The Champions League final.
Yeah. But
How is it that they have never had this, or have not got this, or have they backslid? That's the question. I mean, look, we've been going to these events for 2 decades, so presumably they have had some. They don't just completely just hand it off to these local authorities. They do have a role in this. Maybe might be convenient to say they don't right now, but this is UEFA's biggest prize. Surely they have responsibility over securing something.
Although not jurisdiction over the police. Ultimately, in a country like France, you can't tell them what.
But that's not what Martyn was saying.
No,
He's not
well,
jurisdiction over the police.
I think
It's not signage.
Well, I think what they say is that they have sort of control over the stadium, but not outside the stadium, which I think I've always thought that's a bit of a sort of and all football authorities use that, and I think that's a bit of a sort of lame excuse.
And one of the issues clearly was in Paris, there were not enough staff around. There weren't the volunteers necessarily. And yes, as we've mentioned the pod before, criticism over how governing bodies do use volunteers and they're making so much money from these events. But it needed some people to be offering an excess of information and guidance. There was no one with megaphones sort of giving messages out. There was no one sort of offering those sort of reassuring sense of just what is going on. People you could approach rather than just stewards or security looking people.
Right. So that's to do with the governing body, even if it's on that concourse outside. You remember the London Olympics? You had those people on those high seats. You have World Cups. You have people with megaphones, as Rob said. It just didn't seem like there was anywhere near the level of planning for this event. And I guess it will all, hopefully, not all, because obviously the CCTV's been deleted. Most of this will come out in due course.
And those investigations do continue over at FIFA. One case that concluded this week was Chile's complaint about Ecuador's World Cup qualification. FIFA's legal side rejected claims Ecuador's Brian Castillo was ineligible. The defender played in 8 qualifiers, and Chile claimed he's actually Colombian. Had the case gone against Ecuador, well, the games he played in would have been deemed 3-0 forfeit defeats. But Ecuador's lawyer is dismayed by the verdict, having claimed documents, including birth certificate, backed up the case. FIFA's disciplinary committee says it analysed the submissions and decided to close the case. Will we see the reasons why? That's certainly one to follow, but that about brings an end to this week's episode of Sport Unlocked. From me, Rob Harris, from Tariq, Panja and Martyn Ziegler, thank you everyone for listening. As ever, we're grateful if you can hit subscribe and send us any feedback on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram, where we're at Sport Unlocked. But for now, enjoy the sport in the days ahead. Goodbye.